Ready when you are? Okay, that was the warm-up, and here's the real thing. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Case Hall on this very, very wet Wednesday evening, and to this lecture sponsored by the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel here at MSU. We have a jam-packed schedule of events this semester, so coming up next week, we have two. On Tuesday, we have the first session in this semester's series of conversations on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. That's a 4-session series. If you're interested in that, we have flyers at the table outside. And then next Thursday, we have a lecture right here, 5:30 to 7 o'clock. We'll be welcoming Dr. Yuri Kaparulin, I believe, for a talk entitled Exploring Jewish History and the Holocaust in Ukraine Through Research and Documentary Filmmaking. So that is here in this room, 5:30 to 7 next Thursday. But today we are enormously happy to welcome Dr. Rachel Gross. Dr. Gross is the John and Marcia Goldman Chair in American Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. And she is the author of Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, which was published by NYU Press in 2021 and was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Rachel is going to be here to talk to us about that book project today. And Rachel, among the many reasons that I'm so thrilled that you're here, is because I think in this book you really open up, through your use of ethnography, a much more diverse ways of seeing a broad spectrum of Jewish practices as valid and legitimate and as part of the multitudinous ways of expressing Jewishness. And I'm just thrilled that you're going to be here to talk to us about that today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Gross.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Laura for organizing, inviting me, everybody, all the organizations sponsoring this. Thanks to Kirsten Vermajlik for having me in her class, and to the students who put up with me in that class. I'm so glad to be here with you today, and I hope Laura won't kill me if I say that I'm so excited that her book, also by NYU Press, was also just named a National Jewish Book Award finalist. It's very exciting. As I was telling Dr. Vermajlik's class this morning or afternoon, I teach in a Jewish Studies department. Is the mic okay?
I'm actually going to have you use this one. I'm so sorry.
Amazing. I teach in a Jewish Studies department, and my training is in academic religious studies. And religious studies can mean many different things to many different people, to different scholars. To me, being a religious studies scholar means that I get to spend my academic career asking about what is meaningful to people. How do people make meaning in their lives? And like a lot of other religious studies scholars, I think that one goal of religious studies is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And my work in this book is particularly on making the familiar strange. So a lot of my work is on analyzing everyday activities that we might otherwise take for granted. And I think that the ways that we tell stories about ourselves, our families, and our communities through everyday activities, and the ways we ask weighty existential questions, like who am I and where do I come from? I think these are really ordinary everyday questions, but I think they're still remarkable ones. So I want to begin with one of my favorite ordinary moments from my research on one way that I see American Jews making meaning in their lives and asking existential questions. And anybody in Professor Vermajlik's class will forgive me the redundancy in this part. One summer, I watched visitors to the museum at Eldridge Street sit down in the pews of the beautifully restored 1887 Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side of New York. They listened to a docent recount the history of this grand synagogue, the first built by Eastern European Jewish immigrants in this neighborhood from the ground up. And when the docent finishes, she led the group out of the sanctuary, and she paused at the back of the room, the back of this grand room. Step into the indentations in the floorboards, she says. And soon people have arranged themselves in straight lines. And she points to the pattern of indentations in the floorboards and says, "Why do you think these are here?" Slowly, the group realizes that they are standing literally in the footprints of former male congregants. The indentations have been made by men shuckling, rocking back and forth in front of their pew as they prayed in the traditional Jewish fashion. And over the years, they had literally left their mark in the soft pine floorboards. Sometimes the docent demonstrates the movement and others copy her. Some of the tourists are familiar with the motion, with the rocking motion from their own synagogue services, and some shuffle more awkwardly, if enthusiastically. Standing in the footprints of former congregants provides an immediate sensory connection to the past, one that engages visitors' entire bodies. And the experience is a highlight for many visitors. As somebody wrote on Yelp, you literally feel the history at your feet. And the docent's careful orchestration of this moment helps visitors experience a connection to past congregants physically and emotionally. So in my book, Beyond the Synagogue, there it is, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, I look at the materials and institutions through which American Jews engage, promote, and teach nostalgia for turn-of-the-century Jewish immigration from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States. And as my teacher, the great Yiddishist Miriam Udell says, I don't expect anybody to buy my book, but if you do, you should not pay retail. So that's up there. In this book, in this research, I found that nostalgia, which I think of as a sentimental longing for, in this case, for Jewish community origins that can't be fulfilled, nostalgia can be both an emotion and a practice. And as a feeling and as a practice, nostalgia has become a prominent part of American Jewish religion since the 1970s and into the present day. So in this book, I look at 4 case studies of the materials and institutions of American Jewish nostalgia. I look at Jewish genealogists, historic synagogues that are used as museums. This is the Eldridge Street Synagogue again. Children's books and dolls, and artisanal delis and other Jewish food sites. This is Saul's Deli in Berkeley, California, now near me, now that I'm based in San Francisco. I find that some of these items and places and the institutions that create and promote and distribute them encourage Americans, and particularly American Jews, to feel nostalgia for a particular story about Ashkenazi history, the history of Jews whose ancestors came from Central and Eastern Europe, and that nostalgia is best understood, as I said, as a part of American Jewish religion. So to make this argument to you, we're going to need to expand our understanding of what counts as religious practice and where we look for religious activities. So what I'm going to do in the rest of my time up here is think about what kind of nostalgia I'm talking about, what we mean by nostalgia, and what I mean by religion. And I'll trace the historical development of American Jewish nostalgia, the forms that it takes, the places where I see it, and then I'll wrap up by thinking about one of the implications of taking this kind of nostalgia seriously as religion. Some scholars and Jewish community leaders worry that American Jews' religiosity is in the decline, but I think my research shows that American Judaism is not in decline, but in fact evolving and flourishing. So, what are we talking about when we talk about religion? a lot of religious studies scholars are increasingly recognizing that the concept of religion, as we normally think about it, is primarily a modern Protestant creation focused on recognizable acts of worship and personal belief. But even though Jewish thinkers and Jewish community leaders have deliberately worked very, very hard to squeeze Judaism into this Protestant model, they've deliberately tried to do that. And Judaism sometimes fits this model and sometimes it doesn't. I think that if we see those divisions between Jewish religion and Jewish culture, we're going to flatten the dynamic ways that American Jews make meaning in their lives. So, I think that religion is best understood as meaningful relationships and the practices, narratives, and emotions that create and support these relationships. And those of you who are religious studies scholars in the field will recognize a couple of important thinkers in this emphasis on relationships. We might think of religion as relationships between the living and the dead, among the living, or between humans and the divine. So there are all kinds of sacred relationships in our lives, and each of these types of relationships might be emphasized at different times and in different ways. My teacher, religious studies scholar Catherine Lofton, says that religion is a way of describing the structures by which we are bound or connected to one another. So thinking about people's relationships with their families, their ancestors, and the divine as central to religion lets us see how people who don't necessarily think of themselves as religious find meaning outside of traditional practices, guided by a variety of supposedly secular institutions and materials. It also lets us see how people who do think of themselves as religious also find meaning in a variety of ways as well. And this slide is a collage of family photographs and an illustration of the writer and artist Sheldon Oberman, who I will come back to. So definitions of religion are not just a matter of academic theory. I love that I get to spend my academic career thinking about this, but I think there are three reasons why we might all think broadly about religion. First, how we define religion has serious legal implications in the United States. Definitions of religion and religious freedom have been used to strengthen white Protestants' claims of racial and religious supremacy, and organizations denoted as religious don't pay taxes, and we give other privileges to religious groups and spaces too. For example, just to choose one example, Native Americans, for instance, have repeatedly made the case, often unsuccessfully, that their practices and their spaces count as religious in a legal sense for these reasons. So I don't think that the things that I'm going to be talking about necessarily are likely to get legal religious recognition, but I want us to understand that the stakes are very high, and that in our everyday world and in our legal world, we are constantly rethinking what counts as religion, that it's actually up for debate all of the time, all around us. Number two, I always feel like slightly awkward saying this for an endowed Jewish studies lecture, but number two is, in the Jewish community, many decisions about large-scale philanthropy are made in ways that have to do with what counts as religion. A lot of major Jewish philanthropists have been persuaded to give money to Jewish organizations that are ultimately designed to make Jews, especially young Jews, either more traditionally religious or more tied to the religiously recognizable institutions of American Jewish religion. So that has to do with power as well. Third, and maybe most important to me, I think that thinking broadly about religion offers us all a new and I think a better way of analyzing how we and how other people make meaning in our lives. It provides a word and a language to help us think about how we make meaning in our lives, how we place ourselves inside stories that we think are important. So, thinking about American Jews' nostalgia for Eastern Europe helps us think about how religion works for many American Jews. American Jewish nostalgic activities connect them to communities that include both the living and the dead, and they provide meaning in the present by telling stories about the past, which are two important features of religious practice. These nostalgic practices build on traditional religious forms of Jewish memory, like how at the Seder, the home ritual for the holiday of Passover, Jews traditionally recite that they too should feel as if they had been freed from Egypt. But thinking about nostalgia as an American Jewish religious practice also helps us think about how American Jews make meaning in their lives beyond holidays and beyond traditional religious practices in their everyday lives. So, the tourists at the museum at Eldridge Street did not just happen to arrive at this historic synagogue and place their feet in the grooves of long ago congregants. American Jews have long seen the Lower East Side of New York, of Manhattan, as a site of authentic emotional connection to community history. Jewish history in the Americas dates back to the earliest years of European colonization, but the majority of American Jews, not all, but by far the majority of American Jews, are descended from Central and European immigrants who immigrated to the United States between the 1880s and 1924. Many of them settled on the Lower East Side and other urban immigrant neighborhoods across the country. And in the early to mid 20th century, they began to move their families out of these crowded neighborhoods into more spacious parts of cities and into the suburbs. But they kept thinking about the old neighborhood, and some of them kept coming back. In the early 20th century, those Jews who had left the Lower East Side were replaced by new arrivals until Congress severely limited immigration in 1924. Beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, as what scholars call a white ethnic revival turned many Americans' attention to their ancestries, American Jews thought about the old neighborhoods with nostalgic longing. Is that where we are? As they did so, American Jews reflected together on this history in a number of different ways. In the mid-1970s, inspired by the African-American roots movement of that era, named for Alex Haley's 1976 book, Roots, which was an imaginative history of an African-American family, American Jewish genealogists began to organize and educate themselves. They wrote manuals and created Jewish genealogical societies. A decade later, in the 1980s, historians and preservationists started paying attention in earnest to the role that historic synagogues might play in Jewish public life. In the 1990s, mainstream publishing houses started publishing an increasing number of children's books depicting Jewish immigration as part of the American story of multiculturalism. And in the early 21st century, Eastern European Jewish culinary revival began with the appearance of new artisanal delis and other Jewish businesses created by food entrepreneurs. American Jews could connect to this past and other Jewish histories through a variety of older types of Jewish institutions and media, such as passively watching a movie or a live performance of Fiddler on the Roof. But I think that the new materials of nostalgia that I'm looking at encourage a more active personal longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history, a connection between your own family history and larger community stories. Longing is active, not passive. Jewish genealogists actively research their family histories. Parents read books aloud to their children. They encourage children to play with new toys. Restaurant patrons literally consume their longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history. Visitors at historic synagogues step into the footprints of past congregants, literally and metaphorically. And the tour guides at the museum at Eldridge Street work hard to bring visitors physically into the story. So nostalgic forms of pop culture pass stories and values onto future generations. We don't normally take restaurants seriously as sites of religion or as sites of public history. Those are programs or institutions like museums that teach history to a broad public. But I think restaurants actually are a really important way to restaurants are a really important way of shaping our emotional reactions to certain histories. Eating is an intimate act that encourages asking and answering questions about ourselves, our identity, and our communities. And Jewish restaurants encourage patrons to tell their family stories. Elise Lerner, the owner of On Rye, a since-closed deli in Washington, D.C., told me, a lot of people come in and they want to tell us these experiences they've had with this food growing up. A lot of restaurateurs and purveyors of Jewish food tell stories of their own family histories and of Jewish community histories through their food, their decor, and their presentation. And like all sites of public history, these eateries have a particular point of view. So for Karen Edelman, the owner of Saul's Deli in Berkeley, California, she told me the principal story told in Saul's Deli is that of Ashkenazi Jews from the old world, from Europe, and then New York, and then they keep going west until they reach California. And I love this story because it makes Saul's Deli and Northern California the absolute center of Jewish history. So nostalgia in this way places individuals and communities in stories that matter and stories that matter emotionally. These new forms of American Jewish public history often involve thinking creatively about the past and the effect of the past on the present. And they challenge who we think of as an authority on Jewish history, identity, and practice. So the Jewish culinary revivalists that I study are deliberately making food fit for the 21st century. They're reimagining classic Ashkenazi dishes in light of concerns about sustainability and reliance on local goods and the slow food movement, as well as their emotional resonance. So when Karen Edelman and Peter Levitt bought Saul's Deli, again in Berkeley, California, from its founding owners, a lot of the ingredients were shipped from New York to Berkeley. And they were participating in the Bay Area's food movement, and Edelman and Levitt began to reshape their menu with local and seasonal ingredients, honoring Ashkenazi. They saw themselves honoring Ashkenazi American cuisine by elevating it, as they would say. But this is my favorite thing. They ran into a pickle problem, as one does. As you may or may not know, a half-sour pickle is properly made from a fresh cucumber and eaten only 6 to 20 days after pickling. After that, you probably don't have a half-sour pickle on your hands. You probably have a full sour pickle on your hands. Some of you are nodding and know what I'm talking about. Full sour pickles are good too, but if you want a half-sour, that's what you have to do. So Levitt and Edelman wanted to serve pickles made from local cucumbers, which are grown between June and November. You cannot get a fresh cucumber after that. But deli customers actually expect a half-sour pickle all year round alongside their deli sandwiches. So for a short while, customers at Saul's had to endure having half-sour pickles alongside their sandwiches only in seasonally appropriate months, along with lessons in agriculture, geography, and Jewish culinary history. As you can imagine, this was a hard lesson for some customers to swallow, so to speak. I think they actually lost that battle, but I really appreciate that they tried. I want to suggest that the purveyors of American Jewish nostalgia, of American Jewish public history, who are deliberately working to create community around particular materials of Jewish public history, should be considered Jewish community leaders or even religious experts. Jewish genealogists, museum staff members, children's book authors, and restaurateurs create and curate the materials designed to elicit particular emotional and religious responses to certain Jewish histories. And these are Jews who are not normally recognized as leaders or experts, let alone religious leaders or experts, either in scholarship or in Jewish community conversations. But I think pointing out their leadership points to how important these organizations are and recognizes that they guide American Jews at least as much as those whose leadership has been recognized, such as rabbis and directors of Jewish federations, American Zionist organizations, and certain other Jewish nonprofits. Let's see. So some of these activities, I think, build on traditional religious forms, Jewish religious forms. Jewish genealogical research is not normally thought of as a religious activity. Latter-day Saints happen to have a whole theology around thinking about genealogy as a religious activity. But in the 1970s, as Jewish genealogy took off, Jewish genealogists learned a great deal from Latter-day Saints' foundational genealogical work and the religious meaning that Latter-day Saints found in the practice, even as they distance themselves from Latter-day Saint practices like baptizing the dead. As Jewish genealogists found their own language to articulate the deep meaning of Jewish genealogy, the fact that it's not recognized as religious, I think, actually allows them a greater freedom of interpretation in the meaning of their practices. And this image, I think, is one of the coolest things that Jewish genealogists are up to these days. These are Jewish genealogists looking at a traditional synagogue memorial plaque. So these boards are often hung in synagogues to record the yard site or the death date of congregation's ancestors. You would pay to have this plaque put up at your synagogue. And on the little red lights are turned on during the week of an ancestor's death, and then you might remember to say a prayer in their memory. So that's a traditional religious practice. Jewish genealogists in the past few years have started efforts to transcribe and digitally index these valuable records. So I love this as a particularly Jewish example of Jewish genealogy. It uses something that is a traditional religious ritual object in the service of a new memorial practice of putting it into these online indexes to be used in new ways. Okay, so I think that these folks are religious leaders. That doesn't mean that anybody gives them a lot of respect, but that's something that Jewish religious leaders of all kinds are actually used to. Nobody listens to Jewish religious leaders uncritically. And many Jews are not interested in listening to like your family genealogist stories. And meanwhile, at historic synagogues, as I was saying this afternoon in class, docents and staff members provide acceptable rules of behavior to visitors. But as I observed in my ethnography of these places, visitors routinely refuse to observe these guidelines. Jewish visitors approach Jewish historic spaces with a sense of entitlement, and that's something that staff members want to encourage, even as they want to regulate visitors' behavior. This comes up with Jewish deli owners, especially those telling stories of Jewish immigration beyond New York. They're constantly navigating conflicts with badly behaved customers. Deli owners routinely told me that customers constantly compare restaurants outside New York to their ideal of a New York deli, even if customers have not been to an actual New York deli in years, if ever. And even if the restaurateurs are repeatedly insisting that they do not want to emulate a New York deli. So at Saul's Deli, Edelman and Levitt tell their customers, recreating the New York deli is not our charge. Food, authenticity, flavor, sustainability, survival, and being true to the values of our culinary roots are our first priority. So like other Jewish culinary revivalists, Edelman and Levitt are trying to shift their customers' framework of authenticity, how they're thinking about what's authentic and what's not, from emulating an ideal place to new stories about Jewish food and history and memory. So Jewish nostalgia in general gives us an emotional connection to the past, but it also encourages a simplistic, streamlined version of any story. The nostalgic longing of American Jews for the stories of Eastern European immigration at the turn of the century and for the Eastern European histories beyond that deliberately center certain types of Ashkenazi experiences, and it's going to marginalize other Jewish stories. So Jewish genealogists, for instance, might find that they have Jewish family members from all over the world, but I think that I find that they're really drawn to the stories of Eastern European immigration that really fits a dominant story. So by necessity, I think the materials and practices of nostalgia are going to exclude certain people and certain stories. I want to tell you this story. I don't want to take up too much time, but nostalgic materials tell us something about whose stories matter the most. One of my favorite things to study is, one of my favorite places to find American Jewish community leadership, actually, is American Girl, which is a widely popular Mattel-owned line of dolls, books, and accessories that started with a line of historical characters representing 8 to 10-year-old girls at various points in American history. In the summer of 2009, American Jewish immigration history was officially induced into the American Girl canon with the debut of the Rebecca Rubin character, the 10th character in its historical series. So the Rebecca doll, book, and accessories told the story of the fictional character of a Jewish 9-year-old girl living on the Lower East Side in 1914. And like all of these dolls, the Rebecca doll is 18 inches tall. She's got vinyl limbs and face. She's got a stuffed cloth body that you can squeeze, eyes that open and close. And the doll and the books tell the story of a girl who is spunky, conflicted, compassionate, and determined. She's the daughter of Russian immigrants, and there's a whole lot of adorable and expensive accessories that you can buy. The books were written by author Jacqueline Dembar Green, who had previously written a whole bunch of, I think, really wonderful children's books about Sephardi Jewish history, about Jewish history from Spain. And her own ancestry includes Sephardi Jews. And she told me that when she was invited to give a proposal to American Girl, and she told me that she thought about writing a Sephardi history. And she lives in the Boston area, and she thought about telling the story of a Jewish immigrant who immigrated through Boston, which was another place that that turn of the 20th century Jews immigrated to. But she ultimately decided, and I think she was right, that the mainstream story of Eastern European Jewish immigrants in New York had to be told first. For many American Jews and non-Jewish consumers of American Girl, Rebecca Rubin is the Jewish story. And this is the story that had to be told first, I think, for commercial reasons as well as Jewish community reasons. The Rebecca doll and the books teach American children of all backgrounds, not just Jewish children, to feel a connection to a certain American Jewish heritage as a way of being an American in general, regardless of their family history. So the doll, the books, the little miniature toys encourage an emotional connection to Jewish immigration history as an American identity through children's play and through consumer culture. Sometimes other stories are folded into this mainstream story. And the menu at Saul's Deli, this is not Saul, but this is Challah food truck. Get it? Challah, right? They're very cute. This was in Columbus. At Saul's and at Challah, they offer a number of Middle Eastern dishes inspired by Jewish cultures in that region. And the owners at Saul's told me that serving Middle Eastern dishes allows them to expand the story of which Jews are included in this story, but it also allows them to serve more vegan and vegetarian dishes, which is important for a deli in Berkeley, California. So this is, I think it's an interesting move. It also, it's more inclusive, but it also literally folds other people's histories into this story of Ashkenazi Jewish history. Mizrahi, Middle Eastern, and Sephardi dishes literally become the side dish to the main Ashkenazi story. So there's a lot of complicated things happening there. Okay. We're going to wrap up. We're going to skip this beautiful children's book, which I'm happy to talk about more. But I'm going to wrap up by thinking about how nostalgic activities like going to a deli or touring the museum at Eldridge Street helps us respond to the claims of Jewish community leaders and sociologists who see Jewish religion on the decline in the United States. So since the mid-20th century, American Jewish community leaders have worried loudly that American Jews' religiosity is waning, something they often describe as assimilation into mainstream American culture. This is, some of you will recognize, Look magazine's famous 1964 cover story about the vanishing American Jew. I am obligated as an American Jewish historian to say that Look magazine no longer exists, but American Jews still do. That's an old joke. Still makes me laugh, though. In recent decades, Jewish community leaders have worried about the effects of intermarriage in what's been termed a marriage crisis or a continuity crisis. But who's making these claims? Congregational rabbis tend to have a really limited definition of religion. They're focused on synagogue attendance and who's performing holiday rituals and life cycle celebrations at their synagogue. Quantitative sociologists are the folks who are looking for activities that can be measured, and they tend to have similar definitions. They're asking who's attending synagogue, who's keeping kosher Jewish dietary laws, who's sending children to Jewish religious schools. And the most recent national study of American Jews, Pew Research Center's study that came out in 2021, but was conducted in 2020, comes out of this legacy, and it divides Jews into Jews by religion. Those are the people who, given a list of religions, will say, my religion is Jewish. Jews of no religion are the people who said none of the above to the first question, and then said that they consider themselves Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background. But I don't think this is a really good way to understand American Jews. I think American Jews, like a lot of other Americans, are just not very good at naming religion in their lives. The division between Jews by religion and Jews of no religion and the related worries about the decline of American Jewish religion are really incorrectly identifying the ways that Jews think about and practice Judaism in the United States. When Jewish community leaders and sociologists are making a division between Jewish culture and Jewish religion, a lot of the ways that American Jews create meaning as individuals, as families and communities are flattened or not even, or are really erased. They don't show up in these studies. I think that a lot of fears about assimilation of Jews into mainstream American culture are resisting the idea that Judaism, like all human endeavors, has and always will change over time. And they're really relying on the idea of a static Judaism, an unchanging Judaism, and a static and unchanging American culture, and seeing the two as mutually exclusive rather than as responsive to one another. And I think we can see the dynamic nature of American Jewish religion in the practices of Jewish genealogists at historic synagogues, at Jewish children's books, and at delis. And again, one word for the ways that we make meaning as individuals, as families, and as communities is religion. And I'm just going to give you one more short anecdote. I've been giving a lot of public talks since my book came out, and as I presented my research, especially to Jewish genealogists at Jewish Genealogical Societies, some genealogists, often men, respectfully disagree with my conclusions about nostalgia and religion, preferring to see their work as the archival or academic, as kind of distanced and objective work, rather than as emotional or religious. Other Jewish genealogists, often women, hear me naming something that resonated with them. "We're doing more than recording names," one woman told me. And what I've tried to do in this book is try to name the more. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have time for questions.
Do you want me to give you this one?
Do we need a mic or
Yes, use that.
what's the practice?
Next one. Hello? 1 second.
Did that one work?
All right, your hand's free now.
Oh, okay. Amazing. Thank you. Okay, awesome. Comments and questions?
Do we need a mic or?
Yes,
Yeah.
Oh, so we're going to pass this one around?
I've been to these things before.
I have not, so you tell me.
There you go.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. You've made me hungry, that's for sure. I'm sure you get that reaction a lot. So I guess I have one comment and one question. The first comment is that Rachel Rubin is from Odessa, so she's from Ukraine, not Russia. And I wonder how Russia's war against Ukraine has sort of impacted memory. Certainly, I know just from our local environment here in Lansing, there's been a significant effort on the part of American Jews to help the citizens of Odessa, in particular Jews of Odessa, but all citizens of Odessa. There's been one particularly active individual who's been running ambulances from Romania to Odessa. So Ukraine is being found, I would say, in this sort of longing and sense of nostalgia as well. So that's really, I guess I posed it as a question, but it's more a comment. My question is about the role of language. That is, a lot of this nostalgia is being transmitted, circulated in English, maybe with some sprinklings of Yiddish as well, but Hebrew is not being centered in the nostalgia engagement. So what's your view on the role of language, the role of English, the role of Yiddish, and maybe also other languages from Eastern Europe, including Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, and others? Maybe those are being used as well. And obviously, when you're engaging in actual research about your ancestors, you're forced to confront historical documents that may be in a language that you yourself don't speak. Thank you, or read.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Okay. Yeah, terrific. Thank you. I'm learning how this works. Rebecca Rubin in the books is explicitly identified as a Russian immigrant. So I think you're correcting the narrative in the books. Thank you. And I think, and a lot of immigrants at that time period from Eastern Europe in general were kind of lumped together as Russian immigrants, correctly or incorrectly, and others will know more about that. The language question is super fascinating. Thank you for that. I think there's a number of ways to answer that, and I will say that I think that American Jewish memory work has really been the kind of centers of American Jewish community, and the way American Jews have centered their memory work has for a long time, I think, had really three pillars, and I think of this as the third pillar. So American Jews have thought about Zionism and memories and community stories around Zionism and Israel and the and certain revivals of Hebrew language as one way to be Jewish. Another has been thinking about the Holocaust and thinking about organizing Jewish communities through memories and memorials of the Holocaust. And I think starting in the late 20th century, even back into the 70s, some American Jews, sometimes alongside that work and sometimes in opposition to it, American Jews have said, you know what, Zionism is really divisive, the Holocaust is really depressing, and this is a third way. So for a lot of American Jews, this is something that is less divisive than Zionism and focusing on Hebrew. And I know that's not exactly your question, but I think it's related. Less divisive than Zionism and more cheerful than the Holocaust. So they've been focused on this Eastern European heritage. In terms of language study, I think my study encompasses a wide variety of people. So a lot of the, what's interesting to me about the genealogists, or I think in general, nostalgia can be something that, like other forms of religious practice, it's something that you can engage in really seriously and that can take over your whole life, or it's something that you can dip into really quickly, right? As with all kinds of religious practices. So you can, I will think of you as a Jewish genealogist if you do a quick search on Ancestry, or if you are a person who, for instance, one of my friends who is in my study, now a friend, began as a research subject, moved to Ukraine, lives in Lviv, speaks Yiddish, does the document work. So a lot of Jewish genealogists are really serious about language study in many ways. And really, Jewish genealogists, I know this is a very long answer, because it was such a wonderful and evocative question. A lot of Jewish genealogists did so much to open up the archives in the former USSR and really paved the way for academics to access those materials. So yeah, thank you for that rich question.
Some of those people, I met some of those people in Odessa, and it's interesting because sometimes they come with no language.
Yeah. Sometimes the genealogy
desperately want to find something out.
Absolutely.
So they rely on.
Yeah, sometimes the genealogists have the language skill and sometimes they don't. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I loved it. And your last answer just made me think of another question, because certainly everything related to Zionism can be complicated and complex, as you imagine, as well as with the Holocaust. But I would think even with nostalgia for this history, it can be a little more complicated, right? Where some families might want to go to the point of origin. So certainly everybody loves food in the delis and can relate to a lot of what you were saying. But on the other hand, you have others idealistic, right, where people lived in such grave poverty when they came here. Life was very tough. A lot of them fled pogroms and therefore sometimes weren't as nostalgic about those languages or wanting to go back to those locations. So I wanted to see, because I think you're absolutely right about that nostalgia, but I wanted you to unpack that a little bit in terms of the contradictions that are also there.
Yeah. Thank you. As I was talking to Kirsten about this a little bit earlier. I think that the story Kirsten was asking me if this is a story of uplift, and I think it's a story mostly of economic uplift. This is not all American Jews are well off, but in this story, American Jews began as quite poor and have now gone up several economic classes. And I think actually that this nostalgia, as you point to, can be quite complicated, but nostalgia is a longing for the past that really revels in the longing, right? So you want to appreciate the longing, but you don't necessarily want to go back there. So I think this is clearest in some of the children's books I look at. Which I skipped in this talk, but some of the children's books talk about how hard this book in particular talks about how hard life was in Russia. Other books will talk about how hard life was on the Lower East Side. The classic All of a Kind family books, if you know those, talk about the East River was dirty and it stank, and people were grimy. I don't know if that's true, but like this is how it's described. I believe the East River stank. I believe that part's true. But they talk about how miserable it was, but they had the warmth of family. So that longing is, oh, it was so hard, but there's something that we've lost, which is the imagined warmth of family, right? So I think nostalgia can hold on to that. It can hold on to, it was terrible, and also I want to revel in that longing for the past. Yeah, thank you for that. Comments, questions?
Thank you, Rachel, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. If you know me, you know that one of the things that I'm really interested in is Jewish education and sites of teaching and learning about Jews and Judaism and Jewishness. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about where you see activities of teaching and learning and education cropping up in these case studies, because it seems to me that at least two of the things that you mention are like formally in the domain of education, right? Children's literature and public heritage museums. But even, delis, you talk about sort of educative functions, and of course genealogy is about teaching. And so in some ways this could all be described as forms of continuing Jewish education, right?
Yes, thank you for that framework, Laura. I appreciate that. I think this is absolutely about establishing a narrative and passing that narrative on, right? And the genealogists, the earliest Jewish genealogists in the 70s, in this form of Jewish genealogy, were really teaching themselves, right? Creating organizations, creating journals to teach themselves, absolutely. The museums I'm looking at are absolutely an informal, sometimes formal educational practice. One thing that I didn't get to talk to as well is PJ Library, which I think we share an interest in. This is, I think, the most powerful Jewish organization right now, at least American Jewish organization. This is an organization that gives free children's books, well, now they've expanded past picture books, free Jewish children's books to Jewish and interfaith families if you sign up or if somebody else signs you up. So all of the books I looked at, all of the children's books I look at in my book are PJ Library books, and they are explicitly trying to change the American Jewish community. They are trying to inculcate American Jewish families into sharing certain stories, sharing certain practices, sharing certain values, and in fact explicitly trying to get families who are not part of American Jewish organizational life into those organizations. And what's interesting to me in terms of education is that these books and these programs are not just about educating children very explicitly, as I'm sure you know. They are very explicitly about educating families, right? So they really want to teach these. They say these are not stories for, even if your child knows how to read, these are not stories for your child to read on their own. These are stories for you to read together and to discuss. So it's absolutely a family educational project, and really a family reorganization project. It's a very, very powerful organization. We need more scholarship on it. I think it's absolutely an educational project, but it's an emotional educational project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great to hear. And again, I actually still have more questions. I still want to think a little bit more about happy ending. I guess I have two. So one of the happy ending questions that I thought about as I was talking to you, that is not actually about sort of an economic uplift, but actually is also about also painful or violence or other kinds of things that people might uncover. So like my mother doing genealogy uncovered a story of bigamy, right, and abandonment. And I know I gave my daughter a book which was, about Jewish life on the Lower East Side that included the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that freaked her out, and she would not go near that book afterwards for a very long time. She just remembered it fondly, but it's like 7 years, since she read it, right? So I'm wondering push or sort of think a little bit more about sort of the ways that there are other kinds of unhappy endings in some of these things. So that's one question that I want to ask. And then another question is just like, I really love the way you've placed this historically, like you're thinking about sort of the 70s, 80s, 90s at this moment. I'm wondering if, I mean, historians don't predict, but I'm wondering like if there are other things that you can imagine sort of moving or happening in the future, or if you think this is kind of like, you know, limited to this moment, if there's something about this moment that has developed these things that you see maybe sort of not continuing in the future. So
thank you. Thank you for those. The happy ending question. I am willing to be pushed on this, but I will say that I think the Jewish nostalgic practitioners that I'm looking at work very hard to find happy endings. When I go to the Eldridge Street Synagogue and hear about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which was horrific and should give nightmares. I mean, it shouldn't give nightmares, but it is horrific. Right, that story is often told in Jewish communities as leading directly to Jewish community labor activists. And that's not actually a happy story either, right? Like that's actually a terrible story too. That's a story of really tough fights, but that the story of labor, Jewish labor activism, especially Jewish women's labor activism, is always told as somehow really cheerful. As you know, my union went on strike this week. We've now ended a strike, but unhappily. but I'm really aware of the ways in which labor activism is not always happening. Genealogists often uncover difficult things. One of the things that I explore, I don't know if this is a happy story, so maybe I'm willing to be pushed on it. One of the things I think about in my book is the ways that Jewish genealogists wrestle with untruth in family stories, which I think is related. What do you do with your ancestor when you uncover that maybe that your ancestor was a bigamist or whatever, but like you were told a different story? And I think some of the more serious genealogists wrestle in really sophisticated ways with what's truth, right? And they wrestle with truth in a way that like is very similar or analogous to religious studies scholars who say, truth is the meaning we find in it, and there's a value and a truth in the family stories we've been told, even if they're not factual. I don't know if that's happy, but it is something they think deeply about. And then your other excellent question was...
History, like placing this in a historical moment.
Oh, yeah. I used to say, until very recently, one thing that was interesting was that I started this work a very, very long time ago, like as a grad student for my dissertation, and people really said that it was like especially the artisanal delis, they assumed that it was like a flash in the pan, and I kind of assumed so too, that artisanal delis wouldn't be a long-lasting thing. And the food trucks I've studied are long since gone, right? But that's the way of food trucks. They're not designed to be long-lasting institutions. One or two of the restaurants that I studied failed, but some of them are like still going and thriving, and maybe their narratives have changed a little bit, but one of them that I studied in San Francisco, Wise Sons, just opened a location in Japan. So like American Jewish nostalgia is just like expanding. It seems to still be going strong. But as you know, I don't know, the last year or two, especially the last few months, American Jews seem to be gravitating towards other narratives. So maybe we will see a change. Thanks.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Rachel Gross.
Thank you all.